Hello everyone, welcome to episode 5 of the most educational chess speedrun on YouTube. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alex and I'm rated just over 2000 elo typically on chess.com, and in this series I'm doing a speedrun from 1000 to 2000 elo. But the reason that it's so educational is because I'm going to be trying my best to explain everything that I'm thinking about during the games and go in depth on my thought process and calculations and reasoning behind the moves that I'm playing and the moves that I'm not playing. And then after the game, go into an analysis to go quite in depth to the areas of the game that are potentially more difficult to evaluate during the game and could use the help of a computer. If you haven't seen the previous episodes of this series, then a playlist is linked below. I hope you enjoy the video. Let's get into the game. Okay, we have the black pieces against Florin Aviatorul from, I believe that's Romania. Perfect. I think we're 5 for 5 on the geography so far in this series, so that's a nice little bonus. But we get a Caro, and we're going to see how white responds to this. I think we've had Caro Kanns and Viennas every single game so far in this series, which I suppose just shows that you can play the Caro Kann and Vienna a lot at this elo range, because most people play e4 and most people respond to e4 with e5. But my opponent goes for the main line of the Caro Kann with d4, and we'll see how he responds to d5. So far, we've had e5 every game, and we have it again, which really does indicate to me that if you are around this elo range and you want to play the Caro Kann, learn the advanced Caro Kann, because it seems like everybody is playing it at this level. I have a whole playlist on my channel dedicated to games that I've played in the Caro Kann, if you didn't know, so that will be linked down below if you want to explore that opening really in depth, because I have a lot of videos on it. But my opponent goes e5. I've said this before, bishop f5 is the main line, but I don't really know it that well, and I prefer the move c5, immediately attacking the center. And if you've seen the previous episodes of this playlist, there are definitely themes that are going to overlap, and my opponent may actually play a similar line to what previous opponents have played. But this opening is very intricate, and there is no shortage of interesting lines in theory that can develop from it. And we do get something different. We get bishop e3, which I don't think I've ever seen on move 4. My first instinct is just to take. And after I assume bishop takes, just go knight c6 and claim my opponent's bishop is misplaced on d4, which it probably is. Another part of me wants to go knight c6 and bait my opponent into taking on c5 so that I can play maybe pawn to d4. Although knight c6 takes, knight takes e5 might be okay. That might be alright. But when you face things like this in the opening, where your opponent plays a move that you've never really seen before, this happens a lot of the lower elo ranges, like in this 1000 to probably 1500 sort of range. Your opponent might know a few moves of theory, but then diverge from it massively with a move like bishop to e3, which makes sense, but there's clearly something wrong about it because you've never seen it before. And this exact thing happened in the previous episode of this series in the Vienna, when my opponent on move 3 played a move that I'd never seen before, and I was like, there is something wrong with that. And I had to spend a while calculating exactly what the issue was, and did end up having a very interesting game from there. So check that out if you haven't seen it. But I am very tempted to take. I don't think bringing the queen out to either of these squares makes any sense. b2 is weak because the bishop is no longer defending it, but I don't know, maybe there is a case to be made for queen to b6, but I think just knight d2, and if queen takes, rook b1, that looks very good for white, so I don't really want to do that. I'm going to take. We'll see what the computer says after the game, whether it preferred knight to c6, but we'll take and go knight to c6 now, putting pressure on the bishop and the pawn on e5. And my thought process is that by forcing the exchange of my c pawn for white's d pawn, this e5 pawn will be quite weak, especially with the move h3. Clearly my opponent wants to put the knight on f3 and doesn't want to allow bishop to g4, pinning the knight. But the issue is, e5 is going to become weak, and f4, the natural move to defend this pawn, now that white has no d-pawn, could be a problem because of queen to h4 check ideas, and there will be no g3 move because the h-pawn no longer controls the g3 square. And if my opponent goes knight to f3 before playing f4, then obviously the pawn won't be able to move, and e5 will be a weakness. So my opponent is definitely not playing this perfectly. I'm tempted to go knight to h6, and this is a common idea in the Caro, to put the knight either on h6 or e7, and then put it on f5 to put pressure on the d4 square, and the e3 square if the bishop goes to e3, which is what happens in more typical Caro Kann lines. Now you can do this by playing e6, knight e7, and knight f5, but there's two reasons I don't like that. Firstly, I want to leave the option to bring my bishop to f5, potentially. It is annoying that it can't go to g4. And secondly, knight h6 is more playable because the bishop has vacated this diagonal, so it can't take and ruin my pawn structure, because it's on d4, obviously. And if I put the knight on h6, not only is it quicker to get to f5, but it also leaves the option open for me to develop my light squared bishop. I have a bit longer to decide what I'm going to do with my bishop. If knight h6 g4, stopping my knight from coming to f5, that's a very interesting way for white to go about the line, and that might actually be a good move from white, which is, again, very, very interesting. So maybe e6. Maybe e6. And yes, my bishop will be locked away, or maybe bringing the bishop to f5 first, and then going e6 is more simple, and then something like knight to e7, and then trade on d4, and then put the other knight on c6. Also very tempting. Queen c7 can be played at any time to put pressure on e5. I'm in no rush at all to play that. Really interesting position. There's also a big case to be made for g6, bishop g7, just fianchettoing and putting pressure on e5, which there is actually a guy at my chess club, like in real life, that plays g6, bishop g7, Caro Kann lines a lot, and he scores very, very well with it against players like 2000 plus all the time. I know he's beaten at 2200 in that kind of position, so it definitely is completely viable online and over the board. This line does look more and more tempting to me. It really does. But, no. Okay, we're going to go bishop to f5. We're going to go bishop to f5. And I'm going to try and keep things simple here. We're going to get the bishop outside the pawn chain. We're going to go e6. I'm going to try and take advantage of the fact that white has played h3 and is therefore a little bit behind in development. I have two pieces developed, white has one. So technically, I'm half a tempo ahead of white in terms of development. I want to go e6. This queen can do something, either c7 or a5 at any point. c3, of course, makes sense to defend the bishop, but again, he's not developing his pieces by playing that. So we're not going to think too hard. We're going to go e6. This bishop can always drop back to g6 to allow the knight into f5, which is sometimes an idea. But we can also consider in the future just taking on d4. And yes, the pawn can take back, but the pawn on d4 is often a massive weakness when there is no c3 pawn to support it. Okay, knight to f3, kind of expected. Again, we could put this knight on h6. We could start with a move like h5 to give the bishop the h7 square. But maybe that's a bit too unnecessary. We probably don't have to waste time doing that. Probably don't. Rook c8 is always a good move, but probably not the time to play it just yet. Knight e7 is perfectly fine. But then I also don't want to take, because after knight takes, my bishop's going to be under attack. So maybe just h6, stopping anything from coming to g5 in the future, giving my bishop a retreating square, and allowing my knight to get to f5. All very viable options. I think I'm going to start with knight g to e7 though. Yes, my opponent can go knight to h4 to go after my bishop, but I don't really care if my opponent takes my bishop, to be completely honest, because one, I get my knight there, which is where I want to put the knight anyway, but two, I'm creating a big, like, blockage in the center of light squared pawns. So if I lose my light squared bishop, it's really not the end of the world, because yes, two bishops are typically better than one bishop, but if I have light squared pawns replacing my light squared bishop, then I still have good control over the light squares. And my opponent offers me a bishop trade. I think I'd rather him take me, so I get free development. So I'm going to go a6. One, so that the bishop doesn't target a7, so that rook c8 is easier to play, so that this knight doesn't have to control that square, but also just to control the b5 square, which can sometimes be a little bit vulnerable to a knight getting to b5, especially considering white's control over the d6 square. That can sometimes be a little bit annoying. We also prepare an eventual expansion with b5 in certain positions. But this feels wrong from white. Knight h4 feels wrong, because this is lining up a bit for us. Now, how can we exploit it? My initial reaction is to take on d3. Queen takes d3, knight takes d4, c takes d4, and knight to c6. Putting pressure on d4 and opening up my queen. And if the knight drops back to f3, then my opponent has just wasted time. That's my initial reaction. We could take on d4 first. And if my opponent takes on f5, we take back with the knight from d4, which wins a piece. So if takes, my opponent has to take like this. But then we still have the same line, and knight to c6. And my opponent's knight is just a bit misplaced and has to go back, which wastes a good bit of time. Although if we take the bishop first and then knight takes, we do tempt my opponent to take with the queen, so that knight to c6 attacks the queen, attacks e5, and the knight is under attack. I guess queen f4 defends everything, but then g5 is just a fork. So white has to be quite careful. I think I'm going to take on d3. I think this probably benefits me more than anybody else. And what's going to happen is that I think my bishop is going to become a very powerful piece. I think. And my queen's going to come to b6 and target these vulnerable dark squares for white. And white is going to have to waste a lot of time. He's moves his knight there, and he's just going to have to go straight back. That's two moves wasted. White hasn't castled yet. I haven't either. But I would argue that white's king is more vulnerable than mine. Takes with a pawn. Let's go knight to c6, putting pressure. Knight to f3, I assume, is the only move here. Nothing else should really be played, I don't think. And then queen to b6, applying a lot of pressure. Looks very good. There's something to be said for knight to b4. Maybe. Attacking the queen, eyeing up c2. Let's say, I don't know, queen to e2. And then rook c8, knight h3. I don't think it quite works for us, unfortunately. We could get this check, but knight d2, and I don't really see what we're accomplishing there. So I'm going to start with queen b6. We're just going to make a threat and apply pressure. Queen b6 cannot be a bad move. Now, we should be aware that if we do castle, then knight to g5 would target h7, And we can defend ourselves with a move like g6, but that could be quite weakening. So this bishop might want to come to e7 just to stop the knight from coming into g5. Again, we don't need to act immediately on that, but it's just something good to be aware of. By the way, if you are enjoying this video so far and finding it useful, then I'd really appreciate if you could subscribe if you haven't already and drop a like on the video, just to show me that you're enjoying this type of content, and also it just motivates me to make more, to be totally honest. Be free though, be free, be free. That's really weakening to the dark squares. Really weakening. Can we do this? I feel like bishop b4 is the move. Bishop b4, knight to c3, I don't think you can get away with. That looks too weak after queen to a5, rook c1. I think I can just take on a2 and be up a clean pawn. If check, knight d2, which makes more sense. We don't have knight to b4, annoyingly. What else can we do, though? Well, if knight to b4, attacking the queen and eyeing up c2, let's say queen d2, then rook c8, knight a3. We have queen a5 attacking the knight, looking at this diagonal, and I don't know if white can defend that. I think white's lost there, because this b3 move has weakened the a3 square, so that the natural square for this knight to go to defend c2 becomes a little bit problematic. Let's see what he does. Let's see what he does. Yeah, queen d1 I think is even worse, though. I think that's even worse, because we're going to go rook c8, and after knight to a3, we're going to go queen to a5, I think. And not only are we attacking this knight, but we're setting up discovered checks on the king, and some potential double checks with knight to c2 or knight to d3, which is going to be completely crushing. I said queen d2 because it blocks this diagonal, so that white is still probably lost, but it might not be quite as bad. But if we have the dual threat of double checks and attacking the knight, then that's just game over. I think white is completely lost. 15 moves in, Caro Kann, we really haven't done anything special. I keep saying that in many of these games that I'm playing in the Caro, because I think it's such a good opening and it's so simple. We haven't done anything special. We took a pawn in the center, we applied pressure, developed our pieces, kept developing our pieces, exchanged some pieces in a way that gave us a lot of activity, made some threats, targeted some pawns, and then I think b3 was a mistake, so we punish it. And yeah, you do have to calculate stuff to make these moves and to disqualify other moves. Like, we disqualified the move knight to... We disqualified the move knight to b4 in this position after doing some calculation and realizing that knight to a3, I believe, just stops all my attacking threats. But here, I'm pretty sure knight b4 is completely winning. We have some very active attacking pieces here. The bishop's still on its home square, but it's controlling some important diagonals. And because we're putting so many of our pawns on light squares, this bishop is very important to our position. Now, let's imagine that we weren't completely winning here, because I think we are completely winning, but let's say we're not completely winning. This bishop is a very, very important part of the position, if that is the case, especially because my opponent doesn't have a dark squared bishop. But even if he did, the bishop normally goes on e3, where it's not really that active, and it more so just performs defensive duties. And our bishop, if it goes to a square like e7, controls some really important diagonals, which white would want to use, because our pawns are on light squares, and white would want to take advantage of the dark squares. So the bishop, the dark squared bishop for black, is a very important piece. Very important. Even though it's still on its home square. Yeah, queen a5 I think completely wins here. I don't see any way for white to defend himself. The queen can't even defend the knight like with this because it just dies. There's no way to defend the knight. So, well, and even if this was played, we could play a move like knight d3 double check, picking up the queen regardless. So this is completely lost. And also, obviously, the rook controls c8. But I'm trying to highlight just how lost the position is for white, because we have so many threats in this position, and our pieces are just very active pieces. White's knight on f3 is stuck just performing defensive duties in the center, and we've moved the game over to the queen side, which has put this knight out of the game, really. My opponent castles, which is probably a sensible move to try and get his king safe, because it was incredibly vulnerable. But of course, we can just pick up a knight. And now let's be accurate. Let's be accurate. What would you play in this position? Well, I think it makes the most sense just to take and exchange a pair of rooks and the queens, because that makes our task far easier, in my opinion, of winning this game. Although, yeah. So I was just calculating a line with, in this position, going king to d7, stopping rook to c7 and rook to c8. But if king d7, knight g5, targeting f7, that's a little bit annoying. So I think the easiest move to play is actually just knight c6, retreating. We keep the pressure on d4. We also make sure this rook can't invade the c file, because we're just going to block it up. Let's play that. There's no way for this knight to be targeted with moves like b5, not only because the bishop controls b4 as it is, but our pawn also controls the b5 square. The pawn on a6 can be a very useful pawn in many positions in the Caro Kann. Again, it's very much about controlling the light squares in the center with the pawns, and then using the pieces to attack the dark squares. But this knight is also nullified because knight g5 does absolutely nothing. My next moves are probably going to be bishop to a3, attacking the rook, and then probably king to e7. You could get very tempted to castle, and it's a fine move. I mean, we're up a piece anyway, but put the king in the center, because we're at the point in the game now where my opponent only has two pieces, and it's a knight and a rook, and my king is not vulnerable at all. So let's not do anything unnecessary like castling when we can just keep our king active. I decided to put my bishop on b4 here because I think it just controls more squares on b4 rather than a3, because the rook moves up so that bishop to a3 doesn't come with an attack. So I think this is a more active move. And we can also consider dropping it back to b6 to target the d4 pawn. Okay, knight g5 is just a bad move. Let's attack the knight. I was considering playing h6 anyway, just to stop that in the future, to let my king come to d7 rather than e7, so I don't have to worry about f7. But knight g5 accomplishes nothing. The knight has to retreat anyway. I think my opponent was trying to get me to play knight to d4 and go, oh, free pawn. The knight no longer defends it, and blunder something like rook to c8, losing a rook. Don't do anything silly. Keep things nice and simple. You're up a piece. And, like, fair play to my opponent. He sets a trap here with knight to g5. Like, this is an issue. A big issue for black if you fall for it. And you're probably completely losing, even though you're up a pawn and you're the exchange down. I think you're just completely losing because of how active white's pieces are there. Just don't fall for it. Don't fall for it. Fair play for my opponent for setting the trap, but let's keep things simple. My next idea is rook to c8, and then probably retreating this knight. Okay, that is just... See, this time that is a free pawn. Now that is a free pawn, because our key... Well, a lot of our pieces are cutting off basically every square on the c-file, and there is no rook to c4 with a fork, so this rook also can't go to d2 to attack my knight. The only safe squares are rook to c1 or rook to b2, and rook to c1 would blunder knight to e2 check, so rook to b2 looks like the only move, Bishop c3 would force rook to b1, but I don't really care about that. If rook to b2, I'm probably just going to play rook to c8, threatening ideas of rook to c1, which white can defend with knight to f1. But then there are ideas of knight to e2, trying to force the king away from the defense of the knight, which currently the rook does stop. But it's worth noting, because actually, if rook b2, rook c8, there are threats of going rook c8 and then attacking the rook, and it's completely trapped because we control every single square because our rook is now controlling the b1 square, which is really funny. Like if a4 gets played, oh well no, then the rook has the a2 square to go to. But yeah, let's just go rook c8. Sorry, rook c1 even. Pinning the knight to the king, stopping the king from moving. And let's say my opponent goes, okay, maybe not g3 allowing this check. Although he might do that. Let's say he goes g3 to try and go king g2 to unpin the knight while still defending it. I think we can just go bishop to c3 and trap the rook, which is kind of hilarious. But again, even though we're up, what, a whole minor piece and a pawn? Yeah, we're up a bishop and a pawn here. You still want to be accurate. Still want to be accurate. I think bishop c3 is still a good move. I think it's still a good move here. Let me think a second. No, bishop c5 I think just wins. You could make an argument for knight to e2 and then bishop c5. But bishop c5 I think is crushing because we just align ourselves with the king. And if you don't do anything, I'm going to deliver something like knight to f3 or knight to e2 double check and win this knight. Which is very bad for white. So if you step away, then I just win the knight. If you try and defend with rook to f2, then I give this check anyway. The rook can't take because it's pinned, and then I just pick up the rook. So this is absolutely game over. We're still playing very accurately though, which I think is very important. Even if you're winning, don't give up silly things, because your opponent's still going to try and do stuff to make your life difficult. Again, just like this knight to g5 move, my opponent sets a trap, and you know what? I reckon at least 10% of the people watching this video, this is not a dig at you whatsoever, would take and blunder. Okay, this is an interesting move. I mean, it doesn't save the position or anything, but it's certainly interesting. Let me think here. Knight f5 check. King e2. I think that is okay for white-ish. We could take on b3, but I don't really want to open up the b file for the rook. That's unnecessary. Oh, wait. I was thinking now we trap the rooks. It doesn't have the f2 square to run to, but it has d2. It does have d2. Oh, this is an interesting position. We could, of course, give this check and just trade the rooks. That's also true. We could go knight c2 discovered check. Oh my... Yo, and then after the king moves, we go bishop to a3. And the knight stops the rook from getting out. And if knight c2, king e2, bishop a3, king d2 trying to attack my rook, we just take on b2 defending the rook, and the rook defends the knight. That is really cool. That is really cool. And there's no knight to e3 either because we defend that square. I think that's really, really cool. I don't know if you guys particularly agree with that. Also, if the king moves too far, you just hang the knight anyway, so worth noting. But yeah, we're just gonna trap the rook. That is so funny. It's so random as well. I mean, obviously we were talking about ideas of trapping the rook for a while, but that is pretty cool. We could give this check as well, forcing the king away from the defense of the knight, but then we have to give this knight up. Check here, takes, and then let's say if rook takes, we can give a check here and win the rook well, trade the rooks. But I think this is more winning. So let's do this instead. There were many times in this position where I could have traded the rooks or traded a set of minor pieces, but we've got so much pressure in the position. We don't really need to settle for just win it for just trading. We can win material here. And worst case scenario, we trade. That's the worst case scenario. So you should still probably try and win material. My opponent gives the rook up for the knight, so we are now up a rook. And my opponent is still in a horrible position. This knight is doing nothing. I can take either of these pawns at any point. Okay, king to d3. I'm going to take on g2, I think, because these pawns are going to become impossible to defend. Let's just clean this position up now. See how my opponent tries to defend it. Interesting as well is my opponent only really started to spend any real amount of time. Oh, the clocks aren't changing. We'll look at it after the game, but he didn't really start to spend time until he already had a lost position, which is interesting. Let's go rook to g3, double attack. Just make sure there's no nasty forks in any way. There's nothing, so don't have to be concerned. There's nothing attacking my bishop that's a problem. But you should be aware of the fact that my opponent does have a knight, and knights are very tricky. So don't blunder anything. f4 would be a horrible move in this position, trying to save the f-pawn because of bishop to c5, and the knight is pinned and under attack twice and will be lost. Let's go bishop to c5. The reason bishop c5 is such a nice move here is because of this relationship between the bishop and the knight, where the bishop completely dominates the movement of the knight. Okay, that's fine. We're going to drop back to b6 and just still monitor this knight's movement. Nothing really that white can do. Let's take on f3 with check. A move like bishop, king to e2. You might be tempted to play rook to f2 check, but the king just defends the knight, and you haven't really accomplished anything there. So it's probably easier just to gobble up the h3 pawn. And this knight still can't do anything useful. If it goes to a3, it has no points of access into the position anyway, which, again, is one of the reasons the Caro is quite good. Like, obviously, we're in the endgame right now, but this is still the Caro Kann structure, and it controls the light squares incredibly well, even still. It shows the power of this structure. Of course, the knight can't even go there anyway, because the rook controls it. You can see just how dominated this knight is. It can't do anything. Of course, we are up so much material, it doesn't really matter, but it's still worth pointing out. It's still very interesting to me, because this is still the Caro Kann pawn structure. This is a very typical structure, especially with the pawn on h6, controlling the g5 square. But come on. I think let's hope my opponent gets on with this a little bit. I'm actually just going to pause the recording here. Oh, no, he resigned. Okay, awesome. I was going to pause it and just play the rest and then show you. But no, my opponent resigns. Very nice game. Very nice. Nothing really too difficult there. I think everything made a lot of sense. And yeah, this bishop e3 move the computer thinks is slightly better for black. And hopefully we punished it correctly. We'll see in the analysis. If you don't want to stick around for the analysis, that's fine. Check out the previous episodes below in the playlist. I'd really encourage you to. But I would recommend watching the analysis though, because there'll be some very interesting points, I am sure, to be covered. So let's get into it. Tell you what, the last 3 games in this series have been very high accuracies. Today we have 94.4% accuracy. So very nice. Let's see what the computer thinks of the game. So e4, c6, d4, d5. Again, my opponent chooses e5, which seems to be like quite the staple at this level. e5, c5, we go after the central pawns. Taking is absolutely fine for white, but it is very difficult to defend both of the pawns in the center. So he chooses bishop to e3. And yes, we did punish it correctly with the move c takes d4. That is the best move. Now, there was a case to be made for knight to c6, and after d takes c5 going d4 and trying to boot the bishop back. But I didn't really see what we were doing here. Like, yeah, we'll probably win this pawn back, but the d4 pawn is kind of weak, and I don't see the point in just giving white the extra pawn anyway. So yeah, playing the way we did with taking on d5, sorry, d4 was the way to go, and then just knight c6 applying pressure. h3 again gives black a bit of an advantage because it makes sense. If you play a move like knight to f3, I will play bishop to g4, and this is an annoying pin, but white just has to live with it. Play a move like knight b to d2, or play a move. Wait, knight b to d2? Oh, because if takes, bishop b5 check. This is a common theme in the Caro Kann, where before the e-pawn moves, and if the light squared bishop and the knight vacate the queen side, you can be forced to block with the queen, and after takes. It's equal material, but white has much better development than black, and black can't castle, so white is slightly better. This is a common theme in the Caro Kann, so be careful of it. But my opponent goes h3. Bishop f5 is the best move. Well, bishop f5 and e6 are fine. Also bishop d7, but that's very passive looking. So this is a fine move. c3, e6, knight f3. We're just playing normal moves here. And knight g to e7 is the best. I didn't like knight to h6 quite as much because of g4 ideas, which the computer does like for white. Thinks that white can play g4 and then try and trade the bishops. And this knight is kind of locked out of the game. I wouldn't be surprised if in some lines it wants to retreat the knight back to g8 to go to e7, or play f6 to try and free up the f7 square. But it's a very awkward place for the knight to be. So knight g to e7 makes sense. Bishop d3 is played. I play a6, which isn't the best idea. It wants to go bishop to e4. And if takes, knight g5, knight f5, knight e4, knight f takes d4, c d4, queen d4, and just trade everything here. And then we're threatening knight c2, and knight a3 can't be played because of bishop takes a3. Unless you play this, and you attack the knight, defend b2. After this check, king c2, bishop retreats, and g3 stopping the knight's escape. Okay then, right, absolutely. But no, a6 I think is a fine move. Bishop e4 is a very strange move to play. I suppose the point is that you free up the f5 square for the knight. So if well no, this hangs a bishop. Oh, I guess the point is that this can't be played because it hangs a bishop. So if knight g5 attacking the bishop, then you take, and then move the knight to g6 or f5 because this knight is now hanging. And if the knight retreats, this is very annoying for white to deal with because g2 is under attack. But whatever, we go a6. I'm still happy with this move regardless of what the computer says, because we kind of throw the ball back into white's court and go, what are you going to do? Because if he takes me here, perfect. We take with the knight, we open up the queen, we pressure the center. The bishop can come to e7, so let's say something like castles, bishop e7. These aren't necessarily the best moves, but they're just typical moves in the Caro. And like, I don't know, knight to b3, rook c8. This is just a nice position for black to play, I think. Nice and easy. The knights are situated perfectly. This bishop is on kind of an ideal square on e7 to control both of these important diagonals for the white position. Sorry, for the black position. And it's just easy going. Queen c7 is probably going to be played at some point to put pressure on e5 and the c file. And b5 is often an idea to maybe put the knight on c4 in some cases. But my opponent goes knight to h4, which is a mistake because bishop d3 actually isn't the best. Knight d4 is better. Again, you can't do this because I'll take with the knight, this knight, so that it's no longer under attack. So if c takes, again, bishop e4 is such a strange move to me, but it makes sense because you lock this knight out of the game by controlling the f3 square. Very interesting stuff. But, okay, we take on d3, which is still good. Knight takes d4, c takes d4, knight c6. Attack the pawn, attack the knight. Apparently queen b6 first was better, but I don't know. I think this is still fine. Knight f3, queen b6, just putting a lot of pressure on the position. And white has one move to not get a really, really bad position here. I don't know if you would find it if I tell you. Well, if I asked you to find it, I don't know if you'd find it, to be honest, because b3 makes sense. Now, I was half expecting knight b to d2, because yes, if I take, you can go rook b1, but knight b4 exists, and you can't take because if knight takes with check, winning the rook. So queen e2, and then I give this check anyway, and then take on a2. The computer thinks that black is completely winning, but this is arguably a little bit difficult for black to play. So the move was queen d2, defending with the queen, and if bishop b4, of course, just knight to c3 blocking, and white is worse, but he's okay. Now, this is very easy for black to play, I think, this position, because black has far more activity than white, and white has a fair few weaknesses, and I don't think black really has any weaknesses. This is one of the pros of the Caro Kann defense a lot of the time, but this is still very much playable for white, just an uncomfortable position. But b3 is played, and knight b4 is an inaccuracy, really. Queen a5 is better. If knight b to d2, bishop a3 is the best move. And if castles, then knight b4, queen e2, queen b5? What? I don't understand this. What happens if takes? A takes. Rook fd1. I guess neither of the rooks can use the c1 square, and this bishop can't be kicked out very easily because knight b1 hangs a rook. What on earth? King d7, knight f1, rook c8, knight e3, I guess defending the c2 square, and then you just lose the a pawn eventually. Such a random line. So the computer calls this an inaccuracy. I disagree. I disagree. Queen d2 was the best move here, though, for white, because after rook to c8, you can't go knight to a3 still, but you can go knight to c3. You can go knight to c3. Although knight to d3 exists. Wow. And after queen takes, rook c3, the queen can't take because of bishop b4, pinning the queen. So queen e2, bishop a3, again holding on to this square. Castles, castles. Black is clearly better here. And honestly, I kind of prefer this position to the one the computer recommended before. I think it's easier to play. Like, rook fd1, rook fc8. Look how easy this is. And if rook d2 trying to stop the infiltration, even bishop c1 is playable, which is hilarious. But like, queen a5? What is the point of queen a5? Knight e1 stopping this, I guess? Bishop b4. Rook back to d1. Attacking the knight? And if this? I guess black still just squeezes the white position as much as possible and potentially wins the d4 pawn in some lines, but very fascinating stuff. There are ways for white to defend, but even if white does defend correctly, the position is still very much unplayable. No human player, like below, I'd say 20, maybe 22, 2300 can defend a position like that. And my opponent plays wrong with queen d1, rook c8, we threaten this. And the best move for white is just to castle and allow the rook to die. And after knight c3, take, you don't even move the rook, you just go, oh no you do, you go rook b1. These are very strange computer lines, but anyway. We go rook c8, my opponent goes knight to a3, and we go queen to a5, setting up this dual threat. And white literally has no way to defend himself. Let's say a move like rook c1 is played. The computer likes just taking because if this double check and the queen hangs and the knight's hanging, it's just game over. So my opponent castles, which is the best idea, just giving up the knight. But we played this very nicely. Just trade everything, go knight c6, which is the actually isn't it. King d7 is the best move. And if knight g5, you allow him to take rook f8, and after knight d6, just trade. So you bait the knight in to trade it off, and then I guess it's easier to defend or to attack. Sorry, for black. Don't know. Interesting stuff though. But anyway, I choose this line with knight to c6, which I personally think is easier to play. My opponent sets up this nice trap of allowing this and losing the game on the spot for the black pieces, which would be a terrible, terrible blunder. But just kick the knight out, bring the king, take on d4. It's a free pawn, rook c8, trying to trap the rook. And white is under so much pressure here. Like, this is ridiculous. f3 is a nice find from my opponent. Bishop c5. Bishop c3 was better, apparently. And then, what? Knight c6. Oh, I guess bishop d4 is unstoppable. Because if you move the king, then we attack the rook. And if the rook moves, then the knight falls. But bishop c5 is still winning. My opponent goes king to f2. And we go knight c2 check, which, I mean, is obviously completely winning. Followed by bishop to a3. And here it's just a very easy cleanup. We dominate the knight, don't let it do anything. And there is nothing for my opponent here. None of these pawns can do anything if you move take, So these pawns can't move. This pawn obviously can't move. The knight can't do anything useful. And the king can't pass the third rank because it's cut off. So I can literally just move the rook and go bap, 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 bap. Game over. I think we did a very good job here of giving our opponent absolutely nothing all game, which is very much my playstyle. A playstyle that some may find boring, but I find very, very fun because I just like being comfortable while playing chess games. Personally, I just like that kind of game. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video and found it useful. I really appreciate the comments in recent videos. Really does give me a lot of motivation to keep making more. Hence why, I'm doing almost daily videos right now and I'm really enjoying it. If you haven't seen the previous episodes of this series, playlist is linked below. And if you have, then YouTube will recommend you a video here, which it thinks you're really going to enjoy. So thank you very much for watching.